I'm Riccardo Albieri, and in this video we are going to integrate some popular JavaScript open source tool, all part of the Vue.js ecosystem, in order to build a list that supports drag and drop of the value list items, and at the same time we'll make sure that changes become persistent in our FileMaker system. So if we rearrange the order of the items on the value list using drag and drop, all these changes will be transferred to the FileMaker backend. So to help us in this demonstration, we will use three new tools introduced by FileMaker 19. The first one is Execute FileMaker Data API, a powerful script step that gives us the ability to request data from FileMaker and get them in JSON format, ready to be transferred to JavaScript. The second one is Perform JavaScript in Web Viewer, that allows us to invoke and execute a JavaScript function, passing a series of parameters if required. The JavaScript counterpart is FileMaker.PerformScript. If Perform JavaScript in Web Viewer allows us to execute JavaScript from FileMaker, FileMaker.PerformScript allows JavaScript to execute a FileMaker script. So we have a two-way communication. Since this is a video about FileMaker, we will try not to go too deep into the Vue.js part. We will therefore use an excellent tutorial available here on YouTube, which explains how to create the list we are about to use step by step. We will then adapt this tutorial to FileMaker, populating the list with the data residing on the customers table and receiving back from the list the changes of sorting. And finally, we'll apply them to the data in our FileMaker backend. So something like, okay, so if we change the order in this JavaScript component, this order needs to be transferred to the backend here. To create our list, we will therefore use Vue.js, but we are going to need a little help from two related libraries, Sortable.js and VueDraggable.js. Luckily, Vue.js and the related libraries are solving a lot of technical problems for us. So let's see how to build a value list able to manage drag and drop. And once we have this component ready, we are going to write a FileMaker script that keeps our data model, a FileMaker table we are seeing here that provides data for the list, in sync with these changes that occur in the UI. So let's start by creating a file that will contain just the basic information for both the HTML part and the JavaScript code. After referencing our libraries here, let's create a dedicated style for our sortable element, this one. This style will appear when we actually drag and drop the elements of the value list. As we can see, it has a move type cursor to make the user more aware of what is about to happen. So let's see what happens if we change it. So change this cursor to grab. Let's see what happens. As you can see, now the cursor is a hand instead of this indicator that it's much more useful to make the user understand that these elements are movable. We are also adding a sortable drag class with opacity set to 0 in order to disable the default transparency and create our ghost class, which will be the one that applies to the object when we move it. This class will show an element visible from the left edge of the selected row, 6 pixels thick, solid, and blue. Of course, we can have fun with this class and apply whatever formatting we can think of. So let's see, for instance, as we can see, we don't have a transparency, but we have this indicator. So when we move it, we see that element appear. But if we can change it, so for instance, if we set a very, very high number here, we'll see that the size of the element changes immediately. Now it's a time to deal with what we actually need to show, which is our list, because here we are just referencing 3 libraries and creating a style. So let's go a little bit further. We move to the body section and we write the code we see here. That draggable tag, this one, is what actually triggers drag and drop in our list, and we will assign our ghost class here. And very, very important, we will trigger an @end directive that works like a FileMaker trigger. At the end of the event, the code executes a method, basically the equivalent of a FileMaker script. In our case, it will execute a method called onEnd. Now it's time to ask, what happens when our list calls the onEnd method after finishing the drag and drop operation? Okay, let's move another little bit further. Let's see. It's time to write some JavaScript. Let's see here the load data function, which is in charge of receiving data from FileMaker. So it receives this as a parameter. When we invoke it, along with requesting and hopefully receiving the data from FileMaker, we also need to be sure that the method we associated with the end of the drag is executed. We see that onEnd receives an event from which we can read the old and the new index. So in other words, the position previously occupied by our list element and its new position. With these 2 pieces of information, we can also update our table in FileMaker. So we are receiving the data from FileMaker and we are showing it in the value list. But if something changes in the value list, with this information, so the new and the old index, we can update the data model in FileMaker. So we can communicate the changes that happens only in JavaScript in this moment. Now, however, we need to make sure that the magic so far only assumed of our drag and drop value list is persistent, because otherwise we will end up with a list displayed in a certain order but stored in another. So as we said, at the end of the drag and drop operation, Vue invokes a method that passes the old and the new position to the selected FileMaker script. Now what we need is a procedure that applies these changes. So we are going back to FileMaker, and this one is the script that is called by JavaScript. There are actually many ways to do that. One is to search for the moved item using the old index, because FileMaker still doesn't know that something has changed. So at this stage we are sort of living in the past from the FileMaker perspective. So we look for the old index, and then what we need to know is if we are moving upward or downward. And to understand this, we will compare the 2 indices. At this point, we can change the index of the moved element. After that, there is one last thing to do. We need to reorder the other elements accordingly. We could use a loop or opt for the replace field contents combined with the serial numbers option. That's all we need basically. So this way we can keep the two models, the one in FileMaker and the other displayed in the Vue.js value list, in sync. We can see that I use this color to immediately see when an item is changing. So let's start from the beginning. So Spectre is moving to the last position, and everything is happening in FileMaker as well. We can use the debugger. So let's see. We are moving Acme here. The old index is 1. The new index is 0. So it's moving up. We look for the record. We find it, Acme. And then we change the serial numbers of the other items in order not to have duplicates. And we're all set. What happens here is happening in FileMaker as well. Of course, we can do a lot more with this list, maybe attaching other methods when we reorder the elements, or if we want to make something happen when we click on a row. But essentially, these 90 lines of code is what we need to have a nice drag and drop value list in FileMaker.